Hello and welcome to this video where I'm going to test out some contrast paints on how to paint a Blood Angel Space Marine. You saw I'm pushed off the top of the screen there. So these are the main colours I'm going to be using this time. These are all new contrast paints. I'm not actually going to use the technical contrast medium because I just didn't find a need for it in this particular video. But yeah, so I've started off and I've primed the model black. Now, when Games Workshop show how to use these, they don't use this. I've used a zenithal highlight, which is basically I've just used my airbrush to do like a top-down spray using one of the new paints that match the sprays of the newer face contrast undercoats. And so it's the same colour, it's called Wraith Bone, but I've just run it through my airbrush, thinned it down, run it through my airbrush. So there's a base colour paint to match the spray. And the reason I did that is because it gives a much smoother finish, and I just, I didn't want to have to go outside and do it. I could just do it in my spray booth in my studio. So I'm just going to use the contrast paint straight out of the pot. It's Blood Angel red. Now you're going to see I'm not going to do anything special with how I do this. The only thing I'm going to do is make sure that I don't go over the chest eagle on the front, because I want that to be yellow. But the rest of the model, I'm just going to slap the paint straight over it. So this is not a complex painting video at all. This is purely to get a tabletop standard model up and running, and just to see what the models look like when they're painted with contrast paints. Now I am going to use some of the standard paints as well on top, just to add a little bit of interest to the model. It might be that you don't want to do that, you're just looking to get models that are as quick and simple as possible, and if that's the case, then you can just paint it with the contrast paints and nothing else. However, if you do that, they're going to look a bit flat. The effect will work, you'll get like the highlights and shading and things like that, and if you're only interested in just getting something that looks good from a few feet away, so that you can tell what it is on the tabletop, then just using the contrast paints will be fine. Coverage wise, you can see the Blood Angel red here. It's a really strong, nice vibrant red, and remember, this is going over a white base coat. If you used red paint from a pot and you painted it on like this, the coverage wouldn't be any better. So you could do like 2 or 3 coats of this, it would get a very flat finish then. So the way this works is, as it dries, it pulls into the recesses of the model, which are then darker, so you get like this instantly highlighted and shaded effect. Now obviously it's a very simple way of highlighting and shading. There's no light direction as such, it's just picking out the edges, if you like, and the large upward surfaces. But you can then, as you see later when I do in the video, you can then use those surfaces and push them a bit further with the highlights and just make it look a bit neater. But yeah, just remember when you're using these, if you're using quite a strong colour like this, if you want it to be something else, such as red or bone coloured or anything that's lighter than this, then you have to leave it white or whatever colour you're using to paint over as a base colour. When you are using technical paints, they do have to be over a light colour. If you just paint over black, you can see underneath it is affecting the black, but it will make it really dark. And the thing is, if you paint the red over a dark colour that's darker than the red, then you're going to invert the shading technique, because the paint will still run into the recesses. That will mean that it will be darker in the highlight areas, if that makes sense. But yeah, it's just very simple. You just paint straight over it. I will make one important note as well when you're doing these. Make sure that you get rid of the mould lines as well as you possibly can. Because of the way the paint works and it goes into recesses, if there is a mould line, it will pick out the mould line and make it more visible. So that is one kind of negative of these paints, is they will highlight faults on the model. But you know, I do that anyway, so it doesn't make any difference to me. But if you want very quick work, I mean, it probably doesn't matter that much to you if you only just want to quickly slap some contrast paint down on the model and you're not really bothered about any of the fine details, then by all means just ignore the the mould lines. Although I would still say the mould lines on like clipped edges and things that are on the helmets, it is always nice just to get rid of those, because they are focal points on the model. So that's probably the first thing people will see, is if you've got a big nasty mould line there. Yeah, get rid of it. But as you can see, it's really easy to use. Because the paint is obviously quite runny, it's not as thin as a wash, but it is still quite thin. If you load up your brush, it will not have a sharp point on it anymore. And also, you're going to damage your brushes if you let this dry, because it's obviously going to get, because of the way the water kind of effect works, and it'll pull up towards the ferrule as you load up the brush. So make sure you do clean your brushes out quite consistently when you use this, or they'll just wear out quicker. So there you can see that the Blood Angel Red is already dry, and that's the finished effect of that. Now I'm using the Iyanden Yellow on the Chest Eagle. This works really nicely as well. It still has the shaded and highlighted effect, and it still looks yellow, and yellow is quite a difficult colour to paint normally. So yeah, that's pretty cool. What you may be wondering is, why does it look so shiny compared to the photos that I posted? And that's because I give it a coat of matte varnish. And that's really the big difference between the photos that Games Workshop are using and the photos that I'm taking. When you add the matte varnish, it flattens all of the kind of faults that contrast paint might have, because of that sort of satin finish on it. It just makes it look more like flat paint by adding the varnish afterwards, while still having all the shade and highlight that you've got with the paints flowing into the recesses. So here we're using Black Templar. This is basically a black paint. Again, it flows really nicely, has excellent coverage, and it basically does the job exactly as you'd want. It dries to kind of like a dark grey colour, which it needs to, really, so that you can have that highlighted effect. If you need a darker colour, you can kind of glaze over it in a few areas, and that will make those areas look darker while still having the highlight show through on the edges. You'll see actually when I've finished the gun, I do spend 1 second just to do a quick mark down the middle of the gun to make it darker there, and that just makes a big difference, because that makes it look black. So just to stress the point as well, so you saw when I was painting the red, any area on the models where it looks really dark, that's a more concentrated layer of paint, basically. So if you do more layers, the whole model is going to look as dark as the shaded area. And if you wanted just that one colour as a flat colour, it would be fine to do that. It's not going to have the same effect. You're not going to get the shading and the highlighting, because you're basically just making the whole model as dark as the recesses. But it still looks pretty cool as a as that colour, and it will give a nice flat finish. So a few people have said about the contrast colours. You can see it on the red a little bit as well, how you get pooling on some of the flat surfaces. That's going to happen with any sort of wash type paints, just because that's how the paint settles as it dries. The whole point of the contrast paints is that the paint does settle more in the recesses and then less on the smoother area. But you still want some on the smoother area, obviously, or it would just be the whatever primer colour you have underneath it. But because it relies on the flow of the paint and things like that, there's always going to be a certain amount of randomness to the way the paint settles. Here you can see I'm using I need to learn the colours a bit better. Aethermatic blue. I did find this is quite a weak colour, whereas the red is obviously a strong colour. This it only kind of just tints the primer underneath it. If anything for this, I'd recommend just plain white. You know, go as light as you can, just so that the colour shows up on it. Here you can see all the paints have dried now, so those are just one coat of whatever the contrast colour is. It's snakebite leather, I think it is, on the pouch on his belt, and as I said, there was one quick line of black Templar along the middle of the gun, just to make it darker. You could see that I painted in the eyes on the helmet as well. Now this is where the the change happens. So if you don't like that satin kind of look to the model, I gave it a coat of AK Interactive Ultra Matte Varnish, and it completely flattens the model. So you can see there's no kind of shiny elements on it. I've only just started to paint on a couple of extra highlights. So on the wet palette there, you can see I'm just rehydrating it a bit. I'd left it open because I've been using that to paint the Bloodthirster. You'll have to forgive me, it's not recorded very well, this part. I got the model in the wrong position for where the camera was pointing. But it's only very quick. It's not really that necessary to do. It's just something that I wanted to have a quick test on. So basically I'm using Evil Sunz Scarlet, Wild Rider Red and Lugganath Orange. The Wild Rider Red isn't that important even. It's very close to the finish of the Blood Angel Orange, Blood Angel Red, whatever it's. Let me just check. Blood Angel Red, there we go. So it's quite close to that, as well as I had some Mephiston Red on the palette as well. The Mephiston Red works quite closely with the colours in the shade, and the Evil Sunz Scarlet works closer to the highlight colours, and then obviously the Wild Rider Red that's on the palette that I'm using is actually a tone lighter than the highlights on the armour, just a very small amount, but it just lets you work in those contrasts a bit more. Not transitions a bit more, sorry. And here I'm just putting in some quick little spot highlights. Sometimes you see that the heavy metal team do them from Games Workshop, just little spot highlights to make it more reflective looking. And here I am painting off the bottom of the screen. It's just again Wild Rider Red, a line down the middle of the backpack. You can see it's not very well done, but again I was just doing it quickly. The main thing actually that has been highlighted is the face on the Marine. So again it's just those red colours, mainly Wild Rider Red and then the Lugganath Orange, just to let me just check how that is actually Lugganath. Yeah, they have some very strange names. I have no idea what that is, but the Lugganath Orange is down the middle of the face and around the eyes, and I'm just using it here as to do some bright highlights on the armour as well. But apart from these quick highlights I'm just putting on, there's no extra painting done on the Marine armour. So any edges that you see that are picked out and things like that, they're just done. That's how the contrast paint looks. Obviously with the matte varnish to flatten it does help with that effect, but the paint does work pretty much as they describe, as it it shades and highlights for you. I just like to take it a step beyond that just to make the models that bit more interesting. So again, this is Wild Rider Red and then Lugganath Lugganath orange on the forehead. If anyone's interested, the eyes are Warpstone green, Moot green, and Yriel yellow, then with a white dot in the dark corner, starting on a base of black. Yeah, I'm really sorry that I didn't manage to get the camera in the right place for this. So basically what I did there was just an edge highlight on top of the trim on the shoulder pad. So, and the other area that has been caught is the top of the arm holding the gun. Just helps with focal points and things like that. So there's the model with the quick highlights put on. The gun, I did some edge highlights with Daemonette hide, just very quickly, and some white dots you can see on the tip of the gun there, just to make it look more metallic-y. But yeah, oh, and also the base is just sand washed with the Iyanden flesh shade, and then some darkstone sand, or dark sand, I think it is, from Forge World. So yeah, very quick, simple model to paint. But anyway, that's the end of the video, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching.